History doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it begins in silence, then detonates when least expected. One quiet morning became the hinge on which a city's future turned, and a single man, caught in humiliation, became the unwilling center of a reckoning. What unfolded next forced families, officers, and leaders to confront choices that could no longer be ignored. Stay tuned as this story unpacks every turn. Be sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're joining from and what you think lies ahead. Caleb Wright was a seasoned Black FBI agent, 52 years old, who had dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to federal service. He had seen his fair share of violence, corruption, and heartbreak in America, but the one thing he still cherished was the ordinary rhythm of daily life. On this Saturday morning, he stepped into Morrison's Grocery, a small, family-owned store on Chicago's South Side, with nothing more on his mind than picking up a box of cereal. For Caleb, these trips reminded him of simpler times, walking past aisles stacked with produce, hearing the steady hum of refrigerators, and watching neighbors chat casually while filling their carts. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had earned respect through years of service, but even in that simplicity, he carried the awareness of being a Black man in a country where skin color often preceded judgment. Caleb reached for a box of Honey Nut Cheerios, his comfort food for years, when a sharp, commanding voice cut the calm in half. "Put it down. Hands where I can see them." Caleb froze, every instinct sharpened by training and experience. He turned slowly and faced a young white officer, his badge reading Price, who had his gun trained directly on Caleb's chest. The rookie's hand shook slightly, his eyes wide with the adrenaline of power and fear. Customers nearby gasped, and carts banged against shelves as panic rippled through the store. A woman clutched her child and pulled her behind her. An elderly man stepped forward as if to defend Caleb, but hesitated, and a teenager reached for his phone, likely to record what was happening. Caleb's voice was calm, steady, honed by years of de-escalation. "Officer, I'm just shopping." Price's jaw tightened. "You don't belong here. Suspicious activity was reported, and you fit the description." Those words carried the weight of centuries. "Fit the description," a phrase Caleb had heard too often directed at Black men like him. It was vague, convenient, and always dangerous. Caleb had his FBI credentials tucked safely in his wallet, but instinct warned him against reaching for anything. He raised his hands higher, his movements deliberate. "I'm a federal agent. My identification is in my back pocket. May I reach for it?" Price's voice cracked, but he steadied his grip on the weapon. "Don't move. Hands stay up." Tom Morrison, the store's owner, hurried over, his voice breaking with panic. "Officer, that's Caleb Wright. He's lived here for years. He's FBI. He's no threat." Price sneered, refusing to break posture. "Step back, sir. I'll decide who's a threat." The tension grew unbearable, heavy as lead. Caleb felt humiliation burning in his chest, sharper than fear, because in that moment, none of his years of service, none of his sacrifices, none of his authority as a Black federal agent mattered. To this rookie, to the weapon leveled at his chest, he was nothing more than a suspect. His mind raced through his training. Every move could be the last if misread. He remembered other names, other faces, Black men who had died because an officer's fear outweighed their humanity. He thought of how close he was to becoming one more statistic on the evening news. The doors at the front of the store opened, and in strode Chief Samuel Granger, a towering figure with graying hair and the commanding presence of 3 decades in law enforcement. Called by Morrison in desperation, Granger wasted no time. His voice boomed with authority that cut the air like thunder. "Officer Price, lower your weapon immediately." Price faltered, sweat breaking across his brow. "Chief, now!" Granger's roar left no room for hesitation. Reluctantly, Price lowered the gun, his face blanching as reality settled in. Granger stepped forward with fury in his eyes. "Hand me your weapon and badge." "But, Chief, I thought—" "You thought wrong," Granger snapped. "You profiled a man doing nothing more than buying cereal. You disgraced this department. Hand them over." Silence fell heavy as Price handed over his gun and badge, his cheeks burning red with shame. Granger turned to Caleb, softening his tone. "Agent Wright, are you all right?" Caleb lowered his hands slowly, regaining composure. "I'm fine," he answered. though the sting of indignity pulsed deeper than he could show. He looked around at the crowd, neighbors, friends, strangers, all watching, all bearing witness to how quickly a black man could go from respected agent to suspected criminal in the blink of an eye. Some nodded to him in quiet solidarity, others whispered nervously, and more than one filmed the entire ordeal on their phone. Chief Granger laid a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I'll make sure this is handled," he said firmly. But Caleb knew that no punishment handed down to Price would erase what had happened. The morning after the confrontation at Morrison's grocery, Caleb Wright woke to a phone buzzing relentlessly on his nightstand, messages pouring in from colleagues, reporters, and officials who had caught wind of the incident that was already spreading across the city like wildfire. The video footage captured by a teenager in the cereal aisle had gone viral overnight, showing a black federal agent with his hands raised while a visibly nervous white rookie officer pointed a gun at him over nothing more than a box of cereal, the clip sparking outrage, disbelief, and a flood of commentary that exposed the raw fault lines running through Chicago. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples, knowing his quiet life had shattered the moment that rookie had pulled the trigger in his mind, and now the entire city saw him as a symbol. His identity no longer private, his humiliation no longer personal. It had become public property, fueling a narrative of systemic bias that had haunted the city for decades. He dressed slowly, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders, when his phone rang again, this time with the number of Patricia Rodriguez, the deputy director of the FBI Chicago field office, and her voice was sharp but steady. "Agent Wright, you need to come in immediately. The situation is escalating faster than we can manage." Caleb agreed, grabbing his badge and coat, and as he stepped outside into the brisk morning air, he noticed neighbors watching him from porches and sidewalks, some with nods of support, others with wary eyes. The clip had made him both a hero and a target. His very presence now carried meaning beyond himself. At headquarters, Rodriguez wasted no time. "The city is on fire over this," she said, tossing a stack of printed headlines across the table. "Chicago police officer pulls gun on black federal agent. FBI agent targeted for shopping while black. The optics are devastating. The mayor's office is demanding answers, the police department is scrambling, and the press is swarming for a statement." Caleb met her gaze, his voice calm but resolved. "I didn't ask for this, Patricia, but I'm not going to hide from it either." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Good, because this is bigger than you now." She informed him that Chief Granger had suspended Officer Nolan Price without pay pending investigation, but the police union was already framing Price as a rookie unfairly punished for being cautious, their statement painting him as a victim of political correctness gone mad. Caleb clenched his jaw at the thought, knowing how quickly narratives could twist the truth. Later that morning, he walked into the grocery store where it had all begun. Morrison's was quieter than usual, but customers still lingered in the aisles, whispering and stealing glances when they saw him. Tom Morrison himself came forward, gripping Caleb's hand firmly. "You didn't deserve that, Agent Wright, not here." "Not anywhere," Caleb thanked him, but before long reporters appeared outside the store, cameras flashing as microphones were shoved toward his face. "Agent Wright, do you believe this was racial profiling? Do you think the officer should be fired? Do you plan to press charges?" Caleb held his ground, choosing his words carefully. "I believe what happened to me reflects larger issues in policing. I'm cooperating fully with the investigation, and I trust the facts will speak for themselves." His calm demeanor only added fuel to the fire, because by evening news anchors across national networks were replaying the clip alongside his measured response, turning him into an unwilling spokesperson for accountability. While Caleb grappled with his new role, the police department itself was tearing at the seams. Chief Granger called an emergency meeting where lines were clearly drawn. Younger officers like David Kim and Angela Martinez openly admitted the incident was proof of systemic bias that needed addressing, while older veterans like Sergeant Kowalski scoffed that it was an overreaction, claiming that Price had followed his instincts and was now being sacrificed to political pressure. The arguments grew heated, with Granger pounding the table. "This is not about politics. This is about an innocent man nearly losing his life because of bias." But his words did little to quell the storm. Outside City Hall, protesters had gathered by nightfall, signs reading "Shopping while black is not a crime" and "Justice for Caleb." their chants echoing down the streets while counter-protesters waving Blue Lives Matter flags shouted back. The tension simmered dangerously, and Caleb watched it all unfold on the evening news from his apartment, his stomach twisting as he realized the entire city was now wrapped around his humiliation. Maria Lopez, a federal civil rights attorney and longtime friend, came by late that night. She sat across from him with her laptop open, showing him threads of social media posts not only about the confrontation, but also about divisions inside the police department itself, officers anonymously posting about corruption, favoritism, and protection of bad cops. Some defending Price and demanding his reinstatement, others calling for sweeping reform. Maria looked up at him, her voice heavy. "You've ripped open a wound this city has been ignoring for years." Caleb shook his head. "I didn't rip it open, I was just there." "When it burst," she countered. "But that's the point. Your case is forcing people to choose sides, and it's only going to get worse when evidence comes out." He leaned back, staring out the window at the glow of city lights. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from Frank Doyle, the retired chief who had mentored him early in his career. Frank's words were brief but steady. "This isn't your fault. The department needed this reckoning. Stay strong." Caleb let out a long breath, appreciating the support but knowing it didn't ease the weight. Then came another message from Sarah Price, the sister of the rookie who had pointed the gun at him. She admitted her brother was devastated, ashamed, and fearful, claiming he wanted to issue a public apology, but was being silenced by union lawyers. The streets of Chicago burned with voices the night after Councilman Richard Price's name surfaced in connection with obstruction. The viral video of Caleb Wright's humiliation at Morrison's grocery, now joined by a new revelation that the corruption reached beyond a rookie mistake into the heart of political power. Caleb sat in his apartment watching the protests swell on television, people flooding downtown streets with signs demanding justice, some carrying his face printed on posters he had never authorized. Chants of "shopping while black is not a crime" rising like thunder while counter-demonstrators in Blue Lives Matter shirts shouted back. The tension was combustible, and the spark came when someone hurled a bottle across the police barricade. Some swore it came from the BLM side, others swore it was thrown by the counter-protesters. Videos blurred the truth, each side blaming the other. What was undeniable was that within minutes the protest turned from peaceful chants into violent clashes. Tear gas clouded the streets, batons swung, and the thin line between order and chaos snapped. Caleb's phone vibrated endlessly as reporters demanded statements and colleagues begged him to comment, but he ignored them all, transfixed by the chaos on the screen. His name and face no longer private but public property. Maria Lopez arrived at his apartment near midnight, flashing her federal badge to get past security. She pulled out her laptop, her face grim, showing him posts from CPD officers themselves, some demanding accountability, others condemning the federal probe, lines of loyalty drawn not along duty but along bias. Maria's voice carried the weight of inevitability. "This was always going to happen," she told him. "Your case didn't cause the infection, it just lanced it open." Caleb leaned against the window, sirens echoing in the distance, the city unraveling while his life became the axis of its fracture. She told him the FBI cybercrimes unit confirmed Richard Price's credentials were used to delete body cam footage tied to multiple racial bias complaints, meaning either the councilman had done it himself or had knowingly allowed it. Either way, obstruction charges were imminent. Caleb's stomach tightened. Knowing that arresting a powerful white councilman in a city already divided would be like pouring gasoline on a burning street, Maria insisted it had to happen. No one was above the law, not even men with influence and family connections. Caleb nodded reluctantly, realizing the storm would not wait. The next morning, he walked into the emergency task force meeting, the air electric with suspicion. Half the CPD representatives absent in protest, those who attended sitting in visible factions, Sergeant Kowalski glaring at him across the table, accusing eyes sharp as knives. "You wanted this, didn't you?" Kowalski spat. "You wanted to destroy this department." Caleb answered evenly. "What I wanted was accountability. The chaos comes from resisting it." Detective Angela Martinez stood up, her voice firm. "Sarge, we've been burying complaints for years. We've been protecting bad cops at the expense of good ones." Agent Wright just pulled the bandage off a wound we refused to treat. The room buzzed with murmurs, younger officers like David Kim nodding, veterans seething. Rodriguez silenced them with a bang of her hand on the table. "Enough," she said. "We have work to do? Agent Wright, what is your immediate priority?" Caleb's voice carried steady conviction. "Establishing trust. Officers need to know that cooperating won't end their careers. Citizens need to know their complaints will be taken seriously. And Councilman Richard Price," he paused deliberately, "will be arrested this afternoon for obstruction of justice." The room exploded, voices raised, Kowalski's face red with rage. "You can't be serious. Arresting a councilman is a declaration of war." Caleb met his fury with cold resolve. "No, it's the enforcement of law. Richard Price destroyed federal evidence to protect his nephew. That's a felony." Rodriguez looked startled but didn't stop him, knowing Caleb was right. By 3 o'clock, federal agents swarmed City Hall, cameras flashing as Richard Price was led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit unable to hide the humiliation, the footage broadcast live across every major network, the symbolism undeniable. Power stripped bare by accountability, the backlash was immediate, the police union called it a witch hunt, political allies rushed to microphones claiming federal overreach. But for the first time, some politicians broke ranks. Voices rising in cautious support of accountability, the city convulsed in anger and relief at once. Then came Ryan Price's unexpected statement. The rookie officer who had pulled the gun on Caleb appeared on television beside his lawyer and his sister Sarah. His face pale, eyes dulled by medication but voice steady. He confessed that he had drawn his weapon not because Caleb was dangerous, but because of his own prejudice. His words ringing through televisions across the nation. "I pointed a gun at a man because he was black, and I was afraid, not of him, but of what I had been taught to believe. I violated my oath. I'm pleading guilty and accepting responsibility. I am sorry." His admission was raw, imperfect, but historic. A white officer, acknowledging racial bias on live television, Caleb, sat stunned as he watched, his cereal bowl untouched, knowing the statement would not heal every wound, but could shift the conversation. The protests the next day were different. Signs still filled the streets, but some now carried Ryan's words. Proof that accountability was possible even from the guilty. Inside CPD, the split deepened, old guards digging trenches, younger officers finding courage, Martinez and Kim whispering of reform, Kowalski fuming. The city felt like it teetered between collapse and rebirth. Caleb drafted his own statement late that night. His words deliberate: "Justice requires patience, violence helps no one, change is happening." His message ran in the papers and on the morning news. And though cynics mocked it as naive, hope mattered more than cynicism in a city this raw. That night, Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, knocked on his door with soup, her wisdom steady as always. She told him of war and rebuilding, of how destruction offered a chance to build stronger. "You are soldier in war between fear and justice," she said, "whether you chose it or not." Caleb nodded slowly, realizing she was right. Realizing that he was not simply a victim anymore but the face of a reckoning. As he looked out his window at the restless lights of Chicago, he knew the storm was still rising, but he also knew he would not retreat. Because standing down now would mean surrendering not just his dignity, but the hope of an entire city caught between what it had been and what it needed to become. The morning after Ryan Price's confession, Chicago stirred with a new kind of unease. The city no longer simply divided between outrage and denial, but now forced to confront a white officer admitting openly that his fear had been shaped by prejudice. The statement rippled through communities, news cycles, and police stations like an aftershock that no one could ignore. Caleb Wright woke before dawn, exhaustion etched into his bones, his phone vibrating with alerts from across the country, national outlets replaying Ryan's words beside the video of the Morrisons' grocery confrontation, turning Caleb from a local symbol into a national figure. He pulled on his suit jacket with a heaviness he could not shake and drove to the federal building where Patricia Rodriguez was already waiting, her expression carved from stone. She told him bluntly that the arrest of Councilman Richard Price had triggered a wave of fallout. Officers refusing assignments, union lawyers filing injunctions, and city council members fuming that federal agents had humiliated one of their own in front of cameras. Caleb listened silently until she added that the Attorney General had approved the deployment of additional FBI tactical units to ensure order, because the chaos was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, it was boiling, and it was dangerous. Later that morning, he walked into a courtroom packed to the walls, the bail hearing for Richard Price drawing media, politicians, and citizens eager to see whether a powerful white man could truly be held accountable. Richard sat at the defense table, his silver hair immaculately combed, but his face betraying shock. Federal prosecutor James Harrison laid out the charges in crisp, unflinching tones, describing how Price had used administrative access to delete body cam footage tied to racial profiling incidents. Calling it calculated obstruction of justice, Richard's lawyer, Michael Sterling, rose with indignation, insisting his client was a respected public servant unfairly targeted. But Judge Catherine Morris cut through the theater. Setting bail at $500,000 and barring contact with witnesses, Richard accepted the terms with venom in his eyes, his gaze falling on Caleb across the room like a dagger. But Caleb noticed something else beneath the fury, the unmistakable glimmer of fear. Outside the courthouse, the division of the city was visible in raw form. Protesters on one side demanding reform and justice, others carrying signs proclaiming witch hunt, CPD officers lining the barricades with their own biases visible in the way they leaned or shifted. Reporters rushed Caleb as he exited, microphones thrust in his face. Demanding whether he felt responsible for tearing the city apart, Caleb answered with quiet firmness, "Responsibility rests with those who resist accountability, not those who pursue it." His words repeated endlessly in sound bites, dissected on panels across networks. His life no longer his own. By the time he returned to headquarters, Patricia Rodriguez briefed him on new intelligence, intercepted chatter from extremists threatening violence against him, some from the far right who saw him as an enemy of law enforcement, others from the far left who thought he was not pushing far enough. She advised relocation to a safe house, but Caleb refused, his refusal simple: "I cannot hide, I cannot disappear. Visible leadership is the only message that matters." She studied him for a moment, then reluctantly agreed to increase security detail. The task force meeting that afternoon revealed fractures deeper than anyone had anticipated. Detective Angela Martinez presented findings that 17 officers with multiple substantiated complaints had their cases downgraded or dismissed, 13 of those tied directly to Richard Price's influence. David Kim pointed out that the pattern was unmistakable. Not just individual bias, but organized protection. The revelation stunned even some skeptics. And then came the most unexpected moment when Sergeant Kowalski, long resistant, produced a folder he had kept hidden for years. Inside were copies of buried complaints he had witnessed himself, his voice rough with guilt. He admitted that he had stayed silent when he should have spoken, that he had watched rot spread and done nothing. But now, faced with undeniable truth, he wanted to stand on the right side. The room fell into silence as Caleb accepted the folder, thanking him with sincerity, though Kowalski refused the gratitude, saying he should have acted years earlier. The investigation gained momentum, but the resistance grew sharper. That night, Caleb returned to his apartment only to have a brick crash through his window, wrapped in a note reading, "Stop destroying our heroes." His security detail rushed in, weapons drawn, while Mrs. Chen hurried down the hallway. Scolding cowards who throw rocks and run, Caleb held the brick in his hands, feeling the rage of a city compressed into its weight. Kevin, the teenager from next door, arrived breathless with his phone, showing footage already circulating on social media of the perpetrators fleeing, license plate captured clearly. Within an hour, the culprits were arrested, both young men tied to the police union, both claiming they were defending the thin blue line. Patricia Rodriguez called Caleb furious, her voice sharp, telling him the idiots had only made things worse, but Caleb's reply was steady. It shows the true face of resistance, not noble defenders of law, but thugs with bricks. The next morning brought Ryan Price's sentencing hearing. The rookie who had nearly ended Caleb's life now standing before Judge Morris again. The courtroom was filled, quieter this time, less explosive but heavy with anticipation. Sarah Price sat with their mother weeping quietly, Richard barred by law from attending. The prosecution demanded 3 years in prison, citing the seriousness of the civil rights violation, while the defense begged for probation, pointing to Ryan's mental health struggles and his admission of guilt. Then it was Caleb's turn to speak. Standing at the podium, his victim impact statement carrying the weight of truth, he looked Ryan directly in the eyes and told the court that Ryan's act had been dangerous and inexcusable, born not of Caleb's actions, but of systemic prejudice that told him his fear was justified. But Caleb also acknowledged Ryan's courage in accepting responsibility, his cooperation with investigators, his willingness to shed light on the culture that had poisoned him. Caleb requested justice that punished but also taught. Prison time, yes, but also supervised probation, civil rights education, and service to the communities harmed. Judge Morris listened carefully before issuing a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation under the conditions Caleb had outlined. The gavel struck, the sentence sealed, and Ryan turned to Caleb with unexpected humility. The meeting with Ryan Price took place the following afternoon in a secure federal building, and Caleb Wright walked into the small interview room with the weight of skepticism in his chest, wondering if the young officer's plea for a private conversation was sincere or just another attempt to reduce his own punishment. Ryan sat at the table, his wrists cuffed loosely, a federal marshal standing nearby, his lawyer at his side, and Maria Lopez accompanied Caleb with a court reporter setting up to record every word. Ryan's face looked younger than Caleb remembered from the Morrisons' grocery confrontation. His arrogance burned away by prison blues and the sobering reality of consequences. He opened a notebook with trembling hands and spoke before anyone could prompt him. "I need you to understand I am not excusing what I did. I was wrong and I accept it. But you need to know how deep this goes." Caleb listened closely as Ryan described how his uncle, Councilman Richard Price, had not just protected bad cops but had coordinated a shadow network within the Chicago Police Department, a network designed to recruit young white officers susceptible to fear-based rhetoric. Ryan's voice cracked as he explained the so-called reality training sessions that took place off the books, organized by retired officers and active ones under his uncle's direction, where recruits were taught to see certain communities as enemy territory, where they were told statistics justified profiling, where they were instructed how to write reports that masked unlawful stops, and how to protect one another if a complaint arose. Caleb asked how many officers had been through the program. Ryan answered at least 40 that he knew of, likely more, chosen based on their comments during academy training, their social media activity, or their family connections to like-minded officers. Maria leaned forward and pressed. "Will you testify to this officially?" Ryan nodded. "Yes, even though I know it puts my life in danger in prison. But maybe that's justice too. I pointed a gun at you because I was taught to fear you. Someone has to stop them from teaching others the same." Caleb studied the young man, recognizing both guilt and a fragile courage in his eyes. After the meeting, Ryan was led away, his lawyer whispering reassurances, and Maria whispered to Caleb that this testimony could blow the case wide open. Later that evening, Caleb sat with Rodriguez and Martinez in a closed task force meeting, relaying Ryan's revelations. The room tense as the scale of corruption took shape. Martinez cursed under her breath. "Jesus Christ, this isn't a few bad apples. It's an orchard cultivated to be rotten." Rodriguez warned that if they moved too aggressively, evidence would vanish, suspects would coordinate their stories, and the network would bury itself deeper. Caleb insisted the only way forward was simultaneous raids, coordinated strikes at multiple locations to seize records, electronics, and financial evidence before it could disappear. Kowalski, now uneasy but committed, admitted that he had heard whispers of such unofficial training years ago, but had dismissed them as fringe talk. Now he realized the cancer had been real all along. As the task force began planning, Caleb's phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Walsh, Ryan's former fiancée, who claimed she had audio recordings of conversations between Ryan and his uncle from before the grocery incident. Caleb accessed the secure server that night, listening to the January 15th file, his stomach twisting as Richard's voice calmly manipulated Ryan's doubts, telling him that pulling over black drivers was not racism but prevention, that fear was wisdom, that peace was kept by keeping certain people in check. The audio revealed not just prejudice but systematic grooming. Richard using the memory of Ryan's late father, a decorated officer, to convince his nephew that embracing these views was honoring his family legacy. Caleb shut off the recording, sickened by the clarity of indoctrination, knowing now that the conspiracy was not only political but personal, designed to shape young men into tools of fear. The following morning, 3 officers came forward anonymously confirming they too had been pressured to attend the unofficial sessions, and when they refused, they were given undesirable assignments and poor evaluations. David Kim admitted in a meeting that he had been targeted as well, approached with offers to help bridge the Asian community gap, only to realize they were trying to exploit his identity. When he refused, he was punished with months of dead-end tasks. The revelations enraged the younger officers and shook the resolve of the older ones. Preparations for the raids accelerated with federal warrants signed by a judge who read the transcripts of Ryan's testimony and Jennifer's recordings. And by Friday morning, Caleb found himself standing in the rain outside Richard Price's luxurious home, flanked by federal agents and trusted CPD officers, the clock striking 6 as the battering ram broke open the door. Richard answered in his robe with his wife trembling behind him, sneering at Caleb with false calm. "Agent Wright, rather early for a social call." Caleb presented the warrant with unwavering authority. "We are searching your premises for evidence of conspiracy to violate civil rights and organized corruption." Richard tried to protest, to call it harassment, but agents pushed past cataloging encrypted hard drives, burner phones, and a ledger documenting payments to officers for so-called consulting, which were clearly tied to the shadow training program. Richard hissed that Caleb had no idea what he was destroying. "This city needs strong police, not bureaucrats second-guessing every decision." Caleb met his fury with steady defiance. "This city needs police who protect everyone, not ones who see skin color as suspicion." By noon, raids across 17 locations netted 7 arrests, including 2 sergeants and a lieutenant. Dozens of officers were suspended, the evidence overwhelming, with training manuals that explicitly promoted profiling, communications showing coordination to shield guilty officers, and financial records tracing the money back to political donors aligned with Richard. That afternoon, Rodriguez stood before cameras with Caleb at her side, announcing the arrests and declaring that the cancer within the department was being cut out. She emphasized that the majority of CPD served honorably, but that the conspiracy represented a systematic failure that could no longer be ignored. The reaction was instant, the police union furious, community activists jubilant, the media relentless. Chicago cast as a microcosm of America's deepest wounds. But perhaps the most telling shift came from within CPD itself, when more than 40 officers requested to speak with the task force, some admitting to being pressured, others bringing evidence of retaliation, others simply wanting to break free of the silence. Martinez pulled Caleb aside after hours of interviews, her voice low. "You've started something that cannot be undone. This department will never be the same." Caleb asked her if that was good or bad. Martinez sighed. "Ask me in a year. Right now it's just necessary." That night, Caleb returned home to find Mrs. Chen waiting with dinner again, her eyes warm but sharp. "You look like a man who won a battle but fears the war," she told him. Caleb admitted that the war was far from over. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "The war began long before you, but now you are a soldier whether you wished it or not." Kevin chimed in from her apartment doorway, telling Caleb that kids at school now argued about him, some calling him a hero, others calling him a traitor to police, and Caleb asked what he thought. Kevin's answer simple. The raids had rocked Chicago to its core. 7 officers under arrest, dozens suspended, and Richard Price's home office stripped of its secrets. Yet Caleb Wright knew the backlash was only beginning. He sat in the Federal Task Force conference room, staring at stacks of seized files and hard drives, while Rodriguez laid out the next steps. Their evidence was strong, but the resistance was stronger. The police union had already filed lawsuits. Council members loyal to Richard were screaming federal overreach, and extremist voices on both sides were amplifying chaos. Caleb felt the weight pressing in on him, but he refused to flinch. By evening, his apartment window was still boarded from the brick attack, and he found himself pacing the room when the phone rang. Sarah Price's voice shook on the line. She told him Ryan had been moved into protective custody inside prison, but threats against him had escalated. Guards whispering about his cooperation, notes left in his cell, even his meals suspected of tampering. She begged Caleb to ensure her brother's safety despite everything he had done. Caleb assured her he would do everything possible, because Ryan's testimony was not only vital to the case, but proof that accountability and change were possible. Later that night, Mrs. Chen visited again carrying dumplings, telling Caleb with simple wisdom that once you choose to stand, you cannot sit until the work is done. Caleb nodded quietly, knowing she was right. The next morning, federal judges signed warrants for broader raids based on new testimony, and agents prepared to strike at more officers involved in the shadow network, but Caleb sensed danger in the air. As if every step forward pulled more enemies out of the shadows, His instincts proved true when his security detail intercepted credible threats on his life from both directions: far-right extremists calling him an enemy of law enforcement, and far-left activists furious that he was not tearing down the system fast enough. Maria Lopez warned him that his visibility made him a target, but Caleb refused relocation. His presence mattered too much. He told Rodriguez bluntly that hiding now would only empower those who wanted to silence him. At headquarters, Detective Martinez presented new findings that financial records tied Richard Price's network to outside donors, wealthy businessmen with interests in private security contracts and prison labor, their money fueling the indoctrination of young officers. The revelation broadened the investigation from corruption to conspiracy, a systemic attempt to monetize fear and prejudice. David Kim added his own testimony about being targeted for recruitment and retaliated against for refusing, his courage inspiring other officers to step forward. But the more they exposed, the darker the picture became. By Thursday night, Caleb was running on caffeine and adrenaline when Jennifer Walsh, Ryan's ex, sent another message with more recordings, one in which Richard explicitly described how certain officers would be promoted faster if they cooperated with the shadow training program, another where he boasted that the union would always protect their own. Caleb listened with clenched fists, realizing the conspiracy had been operating in plain sight with political cover. Friday morning, the raids began, rain pouring over the city as agents stormed multiple homes and offices simultaneously. Caleb personally oversaw the search of a lieutenant's home, where they uncovered manuals labeled reality training, complete with scripts for stops and interrogations designed to justify racial profiling. The evidence was damning. By noon, 20 more officers were under investigation, and Rodriguez called an emergency press conference declaring that the cancer was being cut out piece by piece. Yet the city's reaction was violent. Protests erupted outside CPD headquarters, angry voices shouting that good cops were being sacrificed. While others chanted for deeper reform, the streets felt like a battlefield of ideals. That night, as Caleb returned home exhausted, he found his security detail rattled. A car had tailed them for several blocks before vanishing. Minutes later, another brick shattered against his building, this time with a note-reading traitor carved in jagged letters. Caleb picked up the shards with steady hands, telling himself he would not break even if the city wanted him to. Inside his apartment, Kevin appeared pale with fear but also with defiance, telling Caleb that kids at school were fighting about him, some calling him a hero, others calling him a disgrace. Caleb asked what he believed, and Kevin answered that heroes do not choose the easy path. They choose the necessary one. Caleb placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that clarity mattered more than popularity. Meanwhile, in prison, Ryan sent another message through secure channels, thanking Caleb for exposing his uncle and warning him that the shadow network ran deeper than anyone realized. He hinted at names not yet revealed, younger officers still under the radar, and promised to testify fully, even if it cost him his life. Caleb read the words with mixed emotions, feeling both sorrow and admiration, knowing Ryan's life was truly in danger. As midnight fell, he received a final call from Rodriguez, informing him that the Attorney General was considering expanding their task force, a model to other cities. But for now, Chicago remained ground zero. Caleb stood at his boarded window watching rain streak down the glass, the city lights flickering like stars on the verge of collapse. And he whispered to himself that he had only wanted a bowl of cereal, but fate had demanded something more. The battle was no longer about one officer or one confrontation. It was about a system, a network, and the soul of a city teetering between destruction and rebirth. And he knew with certainty that he would not step away until the work was finished, even if it meant sacrificing peace, safety, or his very life, because once the truth was revealed, there was no path back to silence. Chicago had never felt so tense. The raids had stripped away illusions, revealing a conspiracy deeper than anyone had wanted to believe, and now every conversation in the city seemed to revolve around the name Caleb Wright. To some, he was a hero who had exposed a rotten network. To others, he was a traitor who had humiliated the police and destabilized the city. Caleb himself felt the dual weight of admiration and hatred pressing in from all sides. And as he sat in his office reviewing stacks of seized evidence, he knew that no matter which way this ended, his life would never return to normal. The files spread across the table painted a portrait of corruption as systematic as it was deliberate. Officers handpicked to receive indoctrination training, reports manipulated to hide misconduct, money funneled through shell accounts, and at the center of it all, Richard Price, a councilman who had wielded his power not to serve but to poison. Maria Lopez sat across from him scrolling through digital transcripts, her voice cutting the silence. "This is bigger than just Chicago, Caleb. If the Attorney General expands this model, we may find the same networks in other cities." Caleb nodded wearily. "But first we need to finish here." Rodriguez entered the room, her face pale with fatigue but her tone sharp. She informed them that overnight more officers had come forward, some with corroborating evidence, some with pleas for protection. The blue wall of silence was cracking, and that terrified those who still clung to it. The police union called an emergency press conference that morning, their president standing at the podium flanked by loyalists, his speech fiery and defensive, accusing the federal government of staging a witch hunt, insisting Richard Price was innocent, and claiming that Caleb had orchestrated a vendetta against law enforcement. The rhetoric was dangerous because it fed the flames of anger already burning in the streets. That afternoon, Caleb's security detail intercepted chatter about a planned protest outside the federal courthouse where Richard's pre-trial hearing was scheduled. By the time Caleb arrived with Rodriguez and Maria, the plaza was a sea of divided voices, one side chanting for justice, waving signs with his face beside the words "accountability now," the other side shouting slogans about federal overreach and loyalty to the thin blue line. CPD officers lined the barricades, but even among them the divisions were clear, some standing stiffly with crossed arms, others shifting uneasily, as if questioning whether they had chosen the right side of history. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Richard sat at the defense table, calm and composed despite the storm outside. His lawyer, Michael Sterling, launched into a theatrical defense, arguing that the evidence seized was circumstantial, that the raids had been unconstitutional, that the testimony of Ryan Price was unreliable given his conviction. But Prosecutor Harrison dismantled the arguments piece by piece, playing clips of Jennifer Walsh's recordings where Richard could be heard shaping Ryan's prejudice with insidious logic. The room gasped when Harrison read aloud excerpts from the seized manuals, teaching officers how to justify illegal stops. Judge Morris listened with her characteristic stoicism, finally ruling that the evidence was admissible and that Richard would proceed to trial. The decision ignited chaos in the plaza, protesters clashing at the barricades, voices screaming, objects flying. Caleb stepped outside, flanked by security, reporters swarming him instantly, demanding comment. He raised his voice above the din. "Justice does not come without resistance. Accountability is not an attack, it is a promise." His words echoed, but were nearly drowned by the noise of anger. Later that night, he sat at his apartment table staring at the cereal box that still lingered like a monument. Untouched since the day of the confrontation, Mrs. Chen knocked gently and stepped inside carrying tea. She sat across from him, her words slow and deliberate. "You think you are alone, but you are not. You think you carry this weight by yourself, but the city carries it with you." Caleb admitted that he feared the city might break before it bent. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Breaking is sometimes the only way to rebuild." Kevin joined them, holding his phone with a video from school, kids debating the case heatedly, some defending the police, others demanding reform. He told Caleb that for the first time his generation was talking about racism openly instead of whispering. Caleb felt a flicker of hope, small but real. The next day, the task force pushed forward with simultaneous interviews. Martinez leading questioning of officers who admitted to being pressured by Richard's allies. Kowalski surprising everyone by volunteering to testify publicly about the complaints he had hidden, his weathered face heavy with regret. He told Caleb that he wanted to spend his final years of service repairing what he had broken. It was a turning point because his credibility among older officers carried weight. Meanwhile, new threats emerged. Caleb's security detail intercepted a plan by extremists to target him during a community meeting. The plot foiled, but the danger constant. Maria urged him to reduce his visibility, but Caleb refused, saying that hiding would betray the people now risking their careers to speak out. The raids and testimonies culminated in another wave of suspensions. Over 30 officers now sidelined, and CPD leadership in turmoil. Rodriguez called it the largest internal purge in department history. The media branded it the Chicago Reckoning. Caleb returned home late one evening to find a message slipped under his door, not a threat but a thank you, handwritten in shaky penmanship. From a woman who said her husband had been harassed for years by bias stops and was finally seeing accountability, Caleb held the note in his hands and felt the exhaustion lift slightly, proof that amid the hatred there was gratitude, that amid the chaos there was progress. As he stared out his window at the restless city, he realized the next phase would not only determine the fate of Richard Price, but the direction of an entire institution and perhaps the soul of Chicago itself. The days following Richard Price's pre-trial hearing were some of the longest of Caleb Wright's life, every hour bringing fresh waves of tension, revelations, and dangers that kept him from sleeping more than a few scattered minutes at a time. Chicago had become a battlefield without gunfire, a place where words, loyalties, and truths clashed louder than weapons. The task force room smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion. Stacks of evidence spread across every table, detectives, analysts, and agents working around the clock to trace the rot within CPD back to its roots. Caleb walked in with Rodriguez at his side, Martinez already presenting updates. She revealed that 43 officers had been flagged for review, 17 facing direct charges, and the rest under scrutiny for suspicious connections to Richard Price's network. David Kim added details of how officers who refused the so-called reality training were systematically punished, transferred to undesirable posts, or drowned in paperwork. Kowalski stood near the back silent until he stepped forward with another folder, this one older than the first, containing decades of complaints he had quietly copied and hidden in his desk, his voice low but steady. "I thought I was preserving proof in case one day it mattered. I never thought it would come to this." Caleb accepted the folder with a nod, telling him it mattered now more than ever. Maria Lopez leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room. She told the team that the recordings provided by Jennifer Walsh had now been authenticated by federal labs, meaning Richard Price's manipulation of Ryan and his grooming of young officers was undeniable. The plan was clear. They would take the case to trial with overwhelming evidence. But to succeed, they needed to convince officers still trapped in silence to step forward. Caleb knew this was the hardest step, breaking the blue wall of loyalty, the unspoken code that had kept misconduct buried for generations. That night, Caleb spoke at a press conference broadcast live, his words direct and unflinching. He told the city that accountability was not an attack on law enforcement, but a defense of its true mission. He invited officers of conscience to come forward, promising protection, and he reminded the public that justice required participation, not just observation. The following morning, something remarkable happened. 20 officers appeared at headquarters unannounced. Requesting to speak with the task force, they described intimidation, retaliation, and indoctrination they had witnessed, some trembling as they confessed, others angry at years of silence. Martinez and Kim interviewed them for hours, compiling a list of names, dates, and locations that widened the conspiracy further. Rodriguez later whispered to Caleb that his words had cracked the wall, and that once cracks appeared, collapse was inevitable. But collapse came with danger, because for every officer who came forward, another doubled down on resistance. That evening, a crowd gathered outside the federal building, smaller than the earlier protests but more dangerous. A cluster of men with faces hidden behind masks carrying banners accusing Caleb of treason. His security detail intercepted one man carrying a concealed knife, another with a bottle of accelerant. The arrests prevented disaster, but underscored how fragile Caleb's safety had become, yet he refused to hide. Insisting his presence gave courage to those finally speaking. Inside CPD, the division reached boiling point, arguments breaking out in squad rooms, veteran officers accusing younger ones of betrayal, younger ones demanding reform, even friendships and families splintered. Agent Cooper, one of Caleb's security detail, admitted quietly that his own brother had been suspended. The conversation painful but honest as Caleb told him that justice sometimes meant family wounds. Cooper nodded reluctantly. The war outside mirrored the war inside, and the city seemed to teeter on collapse. Then came Ryan's letter from prison, handwritten and smuggled through secure channels. In it, he listed additional names: officers who had recruited him, instructors who had trained him, donors who had funded the network. His words shaky but resolute. "I will testify fully. I know it may cost me everything, but if my mistakes can expose theirs, then maybe my life has meaning beyond the gun I raised in fear." Caleb read the letter late at night by the light of a single lamp, his heart heavy but filled with grim determination. The next day, raids expanded further, targeting storage units and financial accounts, uncovering caches of training manuals, cash envelopes, and burner phones that tied the network to out-of-state organizations, suggesting Chicago was not alone. Maria told Caleb bluntly, "This is national now, whether we want it or not." Meanwhile, the community reacted with a mix of exhaustion and hope. Activists held vigils instead of protests. Mothers spoke at town halls about their children finally feeling heard. Newspapers printed editorials demanding permanent reform, and radio shows buzzed with callers arguing whether Caleb was savior or saboteur. In the midst of it all, Mrs. Chen continued her quiet support, delivering food and wisdom, telling Caleb that when walls break, they fall on both the guilty and the innocent, but from rubble new structures can rise stronger. Kevin told him that kids at school no longer just argued, they were organizing debates, writing essays, speaking about justice in ways they never had before. Caleb smiled faintly at the thought that the next generation might see beyond the divisions of the present, yet the work was not done. The Attorney General called Caleb directly one evening, his voice measured but resolute, telling him that Chicago's task force had proven reform could be forced from within and asking Caleb to prepare a framework for expansion. Caleb listened quietly before answering that he would not abandon Chicago until the work here was complete, the AG agreed, but warned him that other cities were already watching, preparing, resisting, as if Chicago were a rehearsal for a national reckoning. By Friday, the task force compiled a final list of officers to charge, warrants approved, raids scheduled, and press releases drafted. Caleb stood before the team, exhaustion lining his face but determination in his voice. He told them that this was the moment they had been fighting for, that the wall was breaking, and that their duty was to ensure it never rose again. That night, as he sat by his window listening to the rain, Caleb reflected on the path that had brought him here. A simple trip for cereal turned into a confrontation, humiliation turned into protest turned into revelation, and revelation turned into the largest corruption case in CPD history. He closed his eyes briefly and whispered that he would see it through, because to stop now would mean surrendering everything gained, and surrender was not an option. The courthouse was overflowing 6 months after the raids had gutted the Chicago Police Department, and Caleb Wright sat in the gallery with a quiet intensity that belied the storm inside him. The trial of Councilman Richard Price had drawn reporters from across the country. Citizens lined up around the block, and activists holding signs on both sides of the barricades outside, some demanding justice, others demanding Richard's release. But inside the courtroom, the focus was absolute. Richard sat at the defense table with Michael Sterling at his side, his tailored suit crisp, his expression carved from defiance, yet his eyes flickered with the strain of a man who had lost the armor of power. Prosecutor James Harrison began his closing arguments with methodical precision, walking the jury through the seized ledgers, the encrypted drives, the burner phones, and above all the testimony of officers who had once feared silence but had chosen truth. He painted a portrait of a man who had orchestrated indoctrination, corrupted public servants, and obstructed justice, not out of error, but with cold calculation. When Harrison played Jennifer Walsh's recordings again, the courtroom fell into a chilling stillness. Richard's own voice instructing Ryan to see black citizens as threats, his calm rationalizations that prejudice was prevention, his manipulations of family honor to twist a young man into compliance. Caleb watched jurors shift uncomfortably, their eyes narrowing as the mask of respectability fell from Richard's words. Then Sterling rose. Delivering a performance honed from decades of defending the powerful, he railed against federal overreach, called the raids political theater, claimed Ryan's testimony was coerced, and insisted Richard was a victim of a vendetta led by an ambitious black FBI agent who had turned a personal grievance into a crusade. Caleb felt the sting of the words but sat still, refusing to let the provocation draw him into anger. Sterling paced dramatically, pointing at Richard as a man of service, a father figure to officers, a scapegoat in a city desperate for reform, but his voice could not erase the mountain of evidence. When he finished, Judge Morris instructed the jury to deliberate. The hours stretched long and heavy, the courthouse buzzing with speculation. Outside protests grew louder, chants echoing through the streets. Caleb sat quietly with Rodriguez and Maria, neither speaking, all three knowing that the verdict would shape not only Chicago but the national conversation. Finally, the jury filed back in, the foreman holding the folded sheet of paper. The room hushed as Judge Morris asked for the verdict. On the count of conspiracy to violate civil rights, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of corruption, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit like a thunderclap. Richard did not flinch. His jaw set, his face pale, but behind him his wife broke into sobs, and his niece Sarah sat stone-faced, her testimony against him having shattered family bonds, but cemented her commitment to truth. Caleb exhaled slowly, not triumphantly, but with the relief of a man who had carried a burden too long. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic but different from months earlier. There were no violent clashes, only eruptions of cheers from some and angry shouts from others. Divided still, but bound by the acknowledgement that justice had been rendered. Reporters swarmed as Caleb exited, microphones thrust toward him, a journalist asking if he felt vindicated. Caleb answered with measured clarity. Justice was served, but this was never about one man. It was about the system he built and the culture that allowed it. The cameras captured his every word, broadcasting them nationally. Rodriguez joined him at the podium, declaring that CPD had begun the hardest transformation in its history. She cited the terminations of 23 officers, the suspensions of 15 more, mandatory retraining, a new civilian oversight board, stricter body camera policies, and a cultural shift that could be felt even if it was fragile. Inside CPD, the impact was undeniable. David Kim had been promoted to head a community liaison unit, building bridges long ignored. Martinez had become chief of training, rewriting the curriculum to emphasize de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Even Kowalski had become an unlikely ally, his grizzled voice convincing veterans that reform was survival, not betrayal. Caleb watched it unfold with guarded hope, knowing progress was fragile but real. Meanwhile, Ryan Price had survived his 18 months in prison, humbled and transformed. He sent Caleb a message from custody, thanking him for not abandoning him, promising to speak publicly upon release about how prejudice had corrupted him. Sarah Price wrote Caleb separately, telling him their family would never be the same, but that her mother for the first time felt free from Richard's poison. Caleb read these words in his apartment late at night, the boarded window now repaired. The brick attacks a memory, but the scars still visible. He thought about the cereal box that had started it all, and realized he no longer needed it as a monument. His life itself had become the monument. The Attorney General called again, offering him the role of leading a national task force to expand the model across other cities. Rodriguez urged him to accept, telling him Chicago had momentum and would carry on. Caleb hesitated but understood the inevitability. He had become the face of accountability, his name a symbol far beyond his choosing. The next morning he visited Morrison's grocery one final time. Tom Morrison insisted on ringing up his purchase personally, sliding a box of cereal across the scanner and refusing his money. "Least I can do for the man who made my store safe for everyone," Tom said. Caleb smiled faintly, replying that stores should always have been safe for everyone. As he walked out, he saw customers nod at him, silent gestures of recognition, reminders that change was not abstract but lived in daily moments. Later at the airport, his security detail shook his hand, Agent Cooper pulling him aside to admit his suspended brother was in therapy now, trying to face his actions. Saying that the investigation might have saved him, Caleb boarded his flight with a heart heavy but resolute, looking down at Chicago as the plane lifted, knowing the city would continue its struggle, imperfect, but better than it had been. As Washington came into view, he reflected on the ripple from that single Saturday morning, a rookie's gun, a councilman's conspiracy, a department's reckoning, and a city's transformation. He knew more battles awaited, other cities with their own shadows, but for now he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not victory, not peace, but the satisfaction of a man who had stood when it mattered. And as the plane touched down, he whispered to himself that shopping for cereal should never have been revolutionary, but in America, it still was, and he would keep fighting until it wasn't. The national spotlight followed Caleb Wright as he stepped into his new role in Washington. The Attorney General had insisted he lead the expansion of the Chicago Task Force model, transforming it into a blueprint for reform across the country. Caleb had never sought the position, never imagined himself as the symbol of systemic change, but the path that began with a gun in his face over a box of cereal had carried him here, and now the burden was his to bear. The first weeks were consumed with meetings, congressional hearings, and endless interviews. senators demanding explanations, activists demanding action, and police unions across the country denouncing him as a destroyer of law enforcement. Yet Caleb endured it all with the same quiet strength he had shown in Chicago, each time reminding the public that accountability was not an attack but a defense of justice itself. Across America, other cities began opening their own files. Whispers of shadow training networks surfacing in Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Philadelphia, and Caleb traveled tirelessly, meeting with frightened officers ready to speak, with grieving families long ignored, with communities that had lost trust decades ago. In each place he told the story of Chicago, not to glorify himself, but to prove that the wall of silence could be broken, that truth could survive. In private moments he often thought back to Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, her wisdom simple but profound. Destruction is opportunity for improvement. Her words echoed as he faced resistance that threatened to swallow progress. One night after a long hearing, he received a call from Sarah Price. Ryan had been released from prison earlier that day, humbled but alive. Sarah told Caleb that her brother was committed to speaking openly about his indoctrination, about the poison his uncle had poured into him, and about the consequences of allowing fear to shape his judgment. Caleb felt a rare sense of pride, not in Ryan's past, but in his willingness to transform, a reminder that justice was not only punishment, but the chance for redemption. Weeks later, Ryan stood at a police academy podium in Chicago, speaking to new recruits about how prejudice had corrupted his oath, how he had nearly destroyed a man's life because of it, and how accountability had forced him to confront his own humanity. His words were raw, imperfect, but powerful, and Caleb received a recording of the speech. Listening late at night in his Washington apartment, the sincerity in Ryan's tone proving that even those who fall hardest can rise if given the chance. Chicago itself continued its transformation. Rodriguez fully confirmed as chief, Martinez overseeing training, Kim bridging community ties, and even Kowalski becoming an unlikely advocate among the old guard. Reforms that had once seemed impossible now written into policy, imperfect but real, fragile but growing. Caleb visited months later. Walking once again into Morrison's grocery, Tom Morrison greeted him warmly, pressing another box of cereal into his hands with a smile, this one on the house again, and Caleb laughed softly, realizing the store had become a symbol of both humiliation and rebirth. Outside on the street, he saw families walking with less fear, officers greeting children with less suspicion, and though the wounds of the city were far from healed, the scars were beginning to knit into something new. Yet Caleb knew the fight was not over. For every city willing to confront its truth, another resisted. For every officer ready to break silence, another doubled down on denial. But he had learned that change was not a wave that swept clean. It was a tide that wore away stone, slow, relentless, patient, and he was willing to be part of that tide until his last breath. The meaning of his journey crystallized not in courtrooms or press conferences, but in the simple right to live without fear, to shop, to walk, to exist as a black man in America without being branded suspicious. And he vowed to keep fighting until that right was not a privilege granted temporarily but a permanent reality. The story of Chicago would echo across the nation, whispered in police academies, debated in council chambers, carried by families who refused to be silent again. Caleb often stood by his window in Washington, watching the city lights, remembering the cereal box, the trembling gun. The humiliation turned into reckoning. He carried the weight, but he also carried the hope. And as he prepared his testimony for Congress, he thought of Kevin's words, "Heroes do the hard right thing, not the easy one." Caleb smiled faintly, realizing the boy had been right all along. He had not chosen to be a symbol. History had chosen him, but he had chosen not to step aside. The last chapter of his Chicago ordeal was written, but the book of reform was just beginning. He whispered to himself that one day the right to shop, to breathe, to live without suspicion would not be revolutionary but ordinary, and until that day came he would not sit, he would not break, he would not surrender, for the work was larger than him, larger than Chicago, larger than even the nation. It was the work of humanity insisting on its dignity, and in that truth, Caleb Wright found peace, not in victory, but in purpose. The end. If this story kept you thinking, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think about the plot. Did the way Caleb's struggle unfolded surprise you, or did you expect the outcome? And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how far these stories reach.